Bon, le micro, c'est bon. C'est OK. On n'a pas besoin.
تست تست تست. Maybe we should start. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon in Geneva at the United Nations office. This is a side event organized, a side event of the Human Rights Council, the 50th session of the Human Rights Council. And this event is organized to talk about the killing of Al Jazeera's reporter Shireen Abu Akleh. Shireen has been killed, directly shot in the head on May 11, 2022, while covering events in the refugee camp of Jenin in the West Bank. She was clearly identified as a member of the press with a helmet and a protective jacket. But she has been shot in the back of her head. United Nations Human Rights Council issued a report on June 24, asserting that the fatal shot came from Israeli forces. Today, we have the pleasure to have with me here in Geneva different high-level persons, and among them the niece of Shireen, Lina Abu Akleh, that will testify about her aunt, about the passion that her aunt had for her work, for her job, and about the situation after the murder of her aunt. I have also the pleasure to have with me Mr. Sami El-Hag, Director of Al Jazeera Center for Public Liberties and Human Rights. I have Mrs. Barbara Triomfi, who is the Executive Director of the International Press Institute, and Jim Bulema, Honorary Treasurer from the International Federation of Journalists. I will first give the floor to Lina Abu Akleh. Lina, the floor is yours.
Fellow respective delegates, journalists, and human rights organizations. 2 years ago, during the 43rd session of Human Rights Council, I was here as an intern representing Palestine, and I had the opportunity to give a statement in one of the interactive dialogues. Little did I know that 2 years later I would come back to give a statement about the killing of my one and only aunt, Shireen Abu Akleh. Shireen wasn't just my aunt, she was also my best friend, my second mother, and my role model. Apart from her being a journalist, Shireen loved life. She was optimistic. She admired art, always supported Palestinian artists, in fact. She was well-read, enjoyed discussing her readings with us. And after a difficult day at work, she would come home and tell us her experiences and her stories from the field. We are a very small family, in fact, only 6 members, now 5. Despite how difficult her job was, she was always there to support our family in every way possible. Palestinian generations grew up listening to Shireen's voice. She entered every home in Palestine through the TV screen, especially during the Second Intifada. Shireen was the voice of Palestine, she was the voice of truth. She also was a role model to young women in Palestine as she succeeded in shattering gender norms. From her, I learned the importance of dedication, courage, hard work, but most importantly, I learned how to be empathetic and compassionate, as she was the epitome of both. In a few weeks, it will be 2 months since Shireen was murdered. And until today, we still haven't attained justice for her. No one has been held accountable, and Israel continues to enjoy impunity. This deliberate crime is the result of decades of Israeli impunity and the international community's failure to hold Israel accountable. Shireen was a very cautious journalist. She always wore her press vest and made sure to identify herself to the Israeli forces. She did the same on May 11th. Unfortunately, she was still targeted. That one bullet that pierced through her changed our entire lives forever. But Shireen's voice was stronger than any bullet, and her funeral was a proof to that. Even during her death, she was still reporting, and she continued to uncover the crimes of Israel. Shireen wasn't killed once, but she was killed twice, once in Jenin refugee camp and the second time in Jerusalem at the St. Joseph French hospital, when the Israeli occupation forces attacked her funeral armed to teeth and began pushing us, beating mourners and pallbearers with batons and throwing stun grenades. I recall running in fear and hiding inside the hospital. The entire attack was a traumatic experience, to say the least, and no one deserves to be violated and degraded in this manner. I failed to comprehend how her funeral was a threat. Did the Palestinian flag draped on her coffin threaten them so much that they had to attack us? I failed to comprehend how until today no one, not one single state, has taken action to hold Israel accountable. Even though states have a responsibility, no argument will ever justify this heinous crime. Where are all the UN member states who are signatories to multiple UN resolutions protecting journalists? It is their responsibility to call out, to condemn, and hold Israel accountable. Shireen is not an exception. Neither Palestine is an exception. It's not an exception. Israel didn't let her live in peace, and they didn't let her go in peace. The attack on her funeral constitutes a war crime and a crime against dignity. Shireen was a Palestinian-American Christian female journalist. When Israel targeted her, they knew very well who she was, and yet they didn't expect this reaction from the Palestinians, because Shireen was from the people and to the people. Shireen being a US citizen, it is their obligation to protect their citizens. Press freedom is at the core of values of the US. A few days before Shireen was killed, President Biden gave a statement on the occasion of World Press Day. In it, he stated the importance of protecting journalists, especially women journalists in the field, since they are a minority. Again, Shireen should not be an exception. Shireen also wasn't the first journalist to be killed, and she's not the last either. The US has an obligation towards the protection of their citizens. While we are very thankful for the support we have received from the US from the very first day, we still ask for an independent and a swift investigation into the killing of Shireen. It is important that the US gets involved directly to ensure that no such future incidents happen. Everything is crystal clear. Eyewitnesses, forensic investigation, and the investigative reports conducted by respective news outlets, and the investigation by the General Prosecutor of Palestine, which has conducted to the international standards, conclusively confirmed that Israeli soldiers targeted Shireen. Al Jazeera and the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs transmitted files to the Office of Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, asking him to expedite his investigation and hold those responsible accountable. Shireen is not an exception. Palestine should not be an exception. Justice and accountability is not an option. It is a must. We look up to the court and expect that the prosecutor will deliver and show the same enthusiasm he has been showing for Ukraine. We call on the UN Commission of Inquiry to investigate the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and to call upon states to cooperate with the Commission of Inquiry and pressure Israel to allow access for Commission of Inquiry to investigate all violations. Lastly, we want justice for Shireen. Justice for Shireen is justice for all journalists who have been targeted and killed. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Lina Abu Akleh, for sharing these memories about your aunt and giving us an update of the situation. I now give the floor to Sami El-Hag, Director of Al Jazeera Center for Public Liberties and Human Rights.
الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. إن الإفلات من العقاب في الجرائم المرتكبة ضد الصحفيين ووسائل الإعلام يهدد حق الجمهور في المعرفة ويجهض الحق في وسائل إعلام حرة، بل ويؤثر بشكل مباشر على جهود الأمم المتحدة القائمة على حقوق الإنسان لتعزيز السلم والأمن والتنمية المستدامة. إن استهداف الصحفيين وقتلهم تفاقم حتى أصبح ظاهرة مؤلمة تزعج الضمير العام. الصحافة ليست جريمة، وقتل الصحفيين هو الجريمة النكراء. وفي هذا السياق نحن في مركز الجزيرة للحريات العامة وحقوق الإنسان نندد وندين بأشد العبارات اغتيال زميلتنا الصحفية شيرين أبو عاقلة التي تشرفنا بالعمل معها ل25 عاما. اغتيلت شيرين بدم بارد برصاصة مباشرة في رأسها رغم أنها كانت ترتدي السدرة المميزة لها كصحفية. نعم، اغتيلت أثناء تغطيتها الصحفية لمعسكر جنين في الضفة الغربية المحتلة في 11 من شهر مايو الماضي. إن الواجب الملقى على عاتقنا اليوم يقضي بتعزيز سلامة الصحفيين والحد من تجاهل التحقيقات الجدية وتقديم الجناة للمساءلة أمام محاكم عادلة ومنع إفلاتهم من العقاب. ولكن لكم أن تتصوروا أن صحفيا يقتل كل 5 أيام بحسب منظمة اليونسكو. الحضور الكريم، لقد شكلت شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية تحالفا قانونيا دوليا يضم فريقها القانوني إلى جانب خبراء قانونيين دوليين شرع في إعداد ملف كامل حول القضية لتقديمها للمدعي العام للمحكمة. نعم، لقد كلفت شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية فريقها القانوني بإحالة ملف جريمة اغتيال مراسلتنا في فلسطين شيرين أبو عاقلة إلى المدعي العام للمحكمة الجنائية الدولية في لاهاي. فطبقا للمادة 8 من ميثاق المحكمة الجنائية الدولية، فإن استهداف المراسلين الحربيين أو الصحفيين العاملين في مناطق الحرب كمدنيين أو الأراضي المحتلة بالقتل أو الاعتداء المتعمد عليهم جسديا يعد جريمة حرب. إننا اليوم في أمس الحاجة للانخراط في عمل مشترك يجمع بين المنظمات والدول والأمم المتحدة لأجل تقوية آليات حماية الصحفيين، بما في ذلك اعتماد تشريع دولي واضح يعتبر قتلهم أو استهدافهم مباشرة في مناطق النزاعات جريمة حرب. وفي الختام لكم أسمى آيات الشكر والتقدير، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sami El-Hag. I now give the floor to Barbara Trionfi, who is the Executive Director of the International Press Institute. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And many thanks to the delegations for being here today, as well as to Al Jazeera and my colleagues here for organizing this important event. From the International Press Institute, which I represent here today, is a global network of editors and journalists dedicated to promoting press freedom and quality journalism, independent journalism. And obviously attacks, independent journalism doesn't exist if journalists have to fear attacks as a consequence of their jobs. And it's for this reason that we have decided today to come to Geneva and talk about the case, the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, because we feel that not enough has been done to make sure that the perpetrators of this crime are brought to justice. And we are very worried that also in this killing, as in so many others, killing of journalists, impunity will in the end persist. The killing of Shireen is one of many journalists. So Shireen is one of many journalists killed this year so far. IPI has counted at least 35 since the beginning of 35 journalists killed since the beginning of the year. But it's a particularly significant and a particularly disturbing one for 2 reasons. One is because of the initial efforts by Israel to deny any responsibility in this killing has been particularly problematic and raises concerns about their intention to carry out an independent investigations. We feel that only after important news organizations like CNN, the New York Times, Bellingcat, important investigative outlets were able to show that the bullet came from an Israeli soldier, only then Israel admitted that there may be the possibility that they are responsible for this. However, they're still arguing that it wasn't a targeted killing and they were targeting Palestinian soldiers. Even more concerning is the fact that some of these independent investigations carried out by news organizations have found that have concluded that the gunshots were both aimed and deliberate, so that Shireen, the journalist, was indeed targeted. And we need to understand why, if it is true, why a journalist would be targeted while she was there just covering the conflict and the facts. The international community has reacted very strongly to this killing in terms of at least a civil society organization immediately brought the case to the attention of the Media Freedom Coalition, asking the government members of the Media Freedom Coalition to take action and ensure that there is an independent investigation, ensure that this crime does not remain unpunished. Shortly after, within a week, 34 civil society organizations, a journalist association from around the world, issued a joint statement also condemning this killing and calling on Israel to conduct an independent investigation involving international experts, calling for the creation of an international task force to investigate the attacks. In the absence of an independent investigation by Israel, calling on the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to conduct an investigation to determine if the killing of Shireen amounts to a war crime. And in general, for government who are allies of Israel, but also others, to hold Israel accountable to its international obligation to end impunity for crimes against journalists. Indeed, what we have seen so far by, for example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that carried out an independent monitoring in this case is more than what we have seen for many other journalists killed. And it's interesting that the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights confirmed that the shot came from Israeli security forces. And additionally, the High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, urged Israel to open a criminal investigation. So, as I said, is more than what we see for other killing of journalists, but is certainly not enough. And just to conclude, I would like to make sure that we remain fully aware that not only the UN has mechanisms, has created various mechanisms to ensure, to fight attacks against journalists and to end impunity in attacks against journalists, most prominently the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists, whose 10th anniversary will be celebrated in Vienna this year. But also to remember all other UN member states that they have signed a number of declarations, resolutions, and other instruments in which they recognize their responsibility to do everything in their power to end impunity not only for attacks against journalists in their own countries, for crimes against journalists in their own countries, but also in other countries, and use diplomatic means and any other possible means to ensure that that these crimes do not go unpunished. And this is particularly important because we know that impunity is, that widespread impunity strengthens the perception that the perpetrators of crimes against journalists will face no judicial consequences and therefore encourages additional attacks. And I think it would be interesting today to understand what are, or in the coming days also as we meet with representative of UN institutions to understand what the next steps are in order to make sure that this crime does not remain unpunished. Thank you.
Unpublished and unpunished. Yes, thank you, Barbara Trianfi. I now give the floor to Jim Bumela, who is the honorary treasurer of the International Federation of Journalists based in Brussels.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. Dear colleagues and friends, I will start by giving you the good wishes of the International Federation of Journalists and its affiliates worldwide, and also thanks to Al Jazeera for this tremendous effort in bringing everybody together. And this is not the first time that we gather at the Human Rights Council to talk about the safety of journalists, but this is the first time that you are here to talk about the tragic story of Shireen. Shireen was our member. She was a member of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate, and as a direct representative of journalists worldwide, we are also responsible for their safety. And whenever there is any one of them is killed, we lose not only a journalist, but a friend and a colleague, a member of our family, who have dedicated their life and paid the ultimate price for his or her work as journalist. And we don't just remember them and pay our respect, but we also protest relentlessly and expose the shameful failure of governments to properly investigate and prosecute the killers. And we lead the fight for justice. In their names, you also do more every day to find ways of making journalism safer. The murder of Shireen has captured the attention of dozens of international institutions and agencies, politicians, celebrities, labor organizations, governments, and millions of ordinary citizens. The list is endless, but for us, the crucial question is not just to comprehend this extraordinary outpouring of emotion her killing has triggered. The crucial question is that she became an emblem of the targeting of Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces, which has been going on for decades and has gone unpunished for far too long. All these murders and hundreds of attacks are well documented. The long list of circumstances surrounding their killings are available. And in every of these cases, the soldier or police officer or border guard who pulled the trigger, their superiors who gave the order, the politicians who make the excuses, they all manage to get off scot-free. And when we scrutinize every case in the list of killed journalists, there are 33 since 1990, a list not put together by NGOs, but by the organization of journalists themselves. You will find that nobody has been held to account. And this means that it's almost virtually risk-free for an Israeli soldier to attack and sometimes kill a journalist. Some say that murder has become the most effective way to silence those journalists. They signal also to thousands of others they could be the next. This generous fear that is hard to measure. And you can imagine the amount of courage and dedication that one need to show to reporting the truth, that journalists, photographers and camera crew need every day to stand in front of the Israeli guns to do their job as journalists. We have been engaged in supporting Palestinian journalists from the first day they joined our organization 40 years ago, and we have solid knowledge of what has been happened to them almost on a daily basis. And for every single case, we have made repeated calls for concerted international efforts to protect Palestinian journalists and to put an end to this impunity. And for decades, we have been pressing Israel to abide by international law and standards, and also to recognize Palestinians as journalists. Israel may be the only country in the world that refused to recognize our IFJ International Press Card, which is a clear demonstration that they are not prepared, despite our continuous campaigning, to recognize Palestinian journalists as journalists, recognize their dignity, and recognize their right to be there to report. And by putting themselves at arm's length every day, they speak truth to power, just like any other journalists worldwide, even if at times that voice is shaky. They have the right to tell the truth, and the world deserves to hear their stories without putting their lives at risk. And our call for many years still remain unheard as successive Israeli government continue to shirk their responsibility. And it is finally the ruling by the judges of the pre-trial chamber of the ICC that Palestine is a state party to the Rome Statutes, which opened the door for us and for the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, a historic turning point. We could quite easily submitted scores of complaints, but we have chosen to submit the case of 4 Palestinian journalists, plus the bombing of the building housing Palestinian media organization in Gaza, and now Shireen with her 2 colleagues, Ali Samoudi and Shatha. And the IFJ submitted these cases to the ICC prosecutor, and they requested him to open an investigation according to his obligation under Article 15 of the Rome Statute. And we know pretty well that it is not going to be a straightforward undertaking. We're well aware of not one, but many mountains we have to climb, but we will fight, and fight relentlessly until these cases are put in front of the criminal court. Because it's not just about the killers of Shireen, but it is about the killers of all her other colleagues in Palestine and the killers of scores, hundreds of killed journalists. And it's not an exaggeration. I cannot help but to recall one of the best quips on the killing of journalists from the late Harold Evans of the Times, when he said, "The price of truth has gone up grievously," encapsulating our grim ordeal where every week we pay with the life of a reporter, a cameraman, a support worker, and today more and more journalists have been targeted with impunity in every corner of the globe, brutalized, gunned down and done to death by the enemies of press freedom. And as a global organization, we were the first to monitor the killing of journalists, which we started some 20 years ago. And when we aggregate all these statistics of killed journalists, we found that no fewer than around 3,000 have died during this period. Can you imagine? This comes to about, on average, 2 journalists or media workers dying every week. And unfortunately, they could become just statistics if it wasn't for cases like Shireen that made headlines and forced the world to stop and notice. And it's not just about recording numbers. All these reports make grim readings, but we only realize what we must do when we are confronted by the scandal of impunity and the failures of government to bring the killers to justice. In fact, it's easy to draw the conclusion that the cause is hopeless. And today's sad reality is that not many journalists can rely on international institutions to defend their rights when they disappear or are jailed or murdered. UN agencies have got a mandate to defend and promote freedom of expression and press freedom, and they all agree with us that the safety of journalists and the fight against impunity are fundamental prerequisites for achieving freedom of expression and democracy. And we know that he's got at his disposal dozens of tools. Barbara talked about them. And they include international human laws, universal human rights laws, covenants, declaration, and resolution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention, including its famous Protocol 1, Additional Protocol 1, Resolution 29, which obliges states to prevent, investigate, and punish crimes against journalists, UN Security Resolution 1738, 7 Declaration, and there are many, many more. All these instruments make it clear that journalists, including embedded journalists, are civilians and must therefore be protected as such. Also, they compel governments to abide by international laws and standards, and they all commit states to refrain from killing, from ill treatment, from unlawful arrest, and other interferences likely to have a chilling effect on all media operators. But we know their weaknesses. Most are non-binding, and they operate incrementally. And from the range of treaties and other instruments, it is clear that the problem of impunity is well recognized, but the major hindrance for the protection of journalists derives not from the scope of the rights, but from the implementation deficit. And this is why we in the IFJ have been promoting within the UN the adoption of a convention on the safety of journalists that will enshrine in a binding instrument all the international norms. We have no doubt that it will be a long road, and we are campaigning to build the biggest coalition to ensure this instrument are for and implemented. Journalists working in dangerous conditions feel isolated and abandoned by the very international institution created to protect their rights, and sometimes by the employers. It is left to us and our organization to speak out forcefully and push back against member states, such as those that seek to block international institutions from fulfilling their mandate and enforcing international law. Finally, I don't need to tell you that there are plenty of cynical voices telling us we should not put faith in such institutions. We don't agree with them. We believe in the rule of law, and we fight day in, day out, and use every international institution to enforce rights and freedom. And that is why we call on all of you to appeal to the ICC to do their job and open an investigation forthwith into the killing of Shireen. It's time to bring the perpetrators of her death to justice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for this very interesting presentation of, unfortunately, of all the cases existed in the past and the problem of impunity, and we are now expecting the member states to take action and not only vote in favor of resolutions or decisions made by the General Assembly. I would like to know if anyone would like to take the floor. Yes, I see the mission of Qatar. Please, the floor is yours.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. At the outset, I would like to commend the convening of the seminar and to thank all those who have contributed to its success, especially at the critical time where increasing reports have been just issued by different parts of the world about violations and acts of violence against journalists. We all know the importance of the role played by journalists and media workers in sustaining democracy, enhancing the promotion and protection of human rights, fighting corruption, realizing sustainable development, and preserving international peace and security. Accordingly, it is vital to ensure that safety of journalists and media workers and guarantee their performance of their work freely, independently, and safely, without hindrance, threat, or violent reprisals. It's now 10 years since the UN Chief Executive Board endorsed the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists, and the issue of impunity recognizing that without freedom of expression, and particularly freedom of the press, an informed, active, and engaged citizenry is impossible. Despite progress made over the past decade and the implementation of the plans, media workers continue to be killed, detained, attacked, and intimidated. In this regard, I wish to recall the condemnation of the State of Qatar in the strongest terms of the Israeli occupation forces, assassination of Al Jazeera correspondent in Palestine, Shireen Abu Akleh, near Jenin refugee camp, and the injuring of the Al Jazeera producer journalist Ali Al-Samoudi, and the assassination of journalist and liberated prisoner Ghafran Warsna at the entrance of Al Arub refugee camp, north of Hebron and the occupied West Bank. These heinous crimes represent a flagrant violations and international humanitarian law and a blatant infringement of freedom of media and expression and the right of people to access information, and therefore should not be unnoticed. Qatar calls on the international community to take urgent action to prevent the occupation authorities from committing further violation and to take all measures to stop violence against Palestinians and media workers and protect them. We also call on holding the Israeli occupation accountable for the crimes and bringing those responsible to international justice. In conclusion, we look forward to a genuine progress in defending the safety of journalists, and we call on member states, the UN system, regional bodies, civil society, the judiciary, and all concerned actors to join forces in furthering the objectives of the UN plans of action. By working together, we can continue to build a safer and more enabling environment for journalists and media workers and protect the right of every citizen to reliable information. Finally, let me take this opportunity to express my sincere condolence to the families of the deceased journalist and to Ms. Lina Abu Akleh, Shireen Abu Akleh niece, and we thank her for being with us here today.
Thank you to the State of Qatar. The floor is to the State of Palestine, please.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And first of all, I would like to thank you for holding this timely event. I will be short, and I just would like to say that our sincere condolences to the family of Shireen Abu Akleh and her colleagues and the families all over the world for losing a very important member and symbol of Palestine. The loss of Shireen is a loss for everyone, and we reiterate our call for the international community to stand up and raise their voices to hold every perpetrator accountable for the loss of Shireen and all journalists across the world and all victims of violence that the occupying power was the reason for that, and for all the victims all over the world for violations of international law. And thank you again. And we salute Lina Abu Akleh, the niece of Shireen Abu Akleh, for her strength and for continuing the legacy of Shireen Abu Akleh. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the State of Palestine. The floor is now to the Republic of Austria.
Thank you, Chair. Let me first of all again express our deepest condolences to Ms. Abu Akleh, the niece of Shireen Abu Akleh, as well as to her family, to friends and to colleagues of Ms. Shireen Abu Akleh. We have already done so in multiple fora, and I would like to do that again today. Austria has both nationally but also as part of different groups condemned in the strongest terms the killing. Only recently, last week, here at the United Nations Human Rights Council on behalf of the Geneva Group of Friends on the Safety of Journalists. And we have also called for an immediate investigation and thorough investigation into this killing, and called for those responsible to be held to account. I think it was also striking to see that during this interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression last week, how many countries have brought up this case and actually also mentioned the absolutely inexplicable high amount of killings of journalists again happening this year. It's really an issue that has become worse over the last years. The situation of media freedom and the safety of journalists and media workers is deteriorating in many places around the world, while over the last years, the number of resolutions and commitments by states on paper have increased dramatically. On the other hand, we still see a lack of political will to implement those commitments. And as long as they're only on paper, they're not worth anything. So it has been mentioned by many of the panelists that this year is the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists, and Austria is going to host a conference on the 4th of November in Vienna on the occasion of this anniversary in cooperation with UNESCO and the OGHR. It is going to be a ministerial conference. Invitations will go out over the next months. And the objective of this is really to instill new energy in the commitments and the UN Plan of Action, and to try to contribute to closing this implementation gap that we have been seeing, unfortunately, and will still continue to see. So in closing, I just want to thank the mission of Qatar, who is a close partner of us here at the Human Rights Council in bringing forward initiatives on the safety of journalists since many years. I want to thank you for organizing this event, and want to thank the panelists for their important remarks. Thank you.
Thank you for the representative of the Republic of Austria. And I would like to remind you that, as mentioned previously, now, since the beginning of this year, in the first 6 months, we have an increase of 100%, with 72 victims in 18 countries, journalists that have been killed. Last year, for 6 months, we had 36 deaths. And the war of Ukraine, of course, and the rampant criminality in Mexico are the main reasons of this alarming deterioration, as mentioned before. So we spoke about impunity. We spoke about the tools that United Nations and the United Nations system has to fight against impunity, against the criminality that is targeting openly journalists. So I would like to know, and I will ask the question is addressed to Jim, and of course to Barbara also, that both have those global network of independent journalists on the one hand, of that International Federation of Journalists on the other hand. I suppose that you did, at your level, as Shireen was a journalist, an independent journalist, reached out to the Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression and Opinion, Madame Irene Khan, who was appointed at that position in August 2020. Did she react directly? And I will also turn, of course, to Lina, because as the niece, but also as someone who's a specialist of human rights, of political science. I suppose that was the first move you did, is turn to UNESCO, that is supposed to defend journalists and the press and the freedom of expression. So I give first the floor maybe to you, Barbara, about that.
Sure. So indeed, Special Rapporteur for Freedom, the UN Special Rapporteur Irene Khan, as well as other representatives from UNESCO and so on, strongly did express condemnation for the killing of Shireen. And they have in different format, they have in joint statement with others. And however, as it was mentioned, you know, how can we turn this condemnation, which we indeed have seen in this case, into action, and into action that brings the perpetrators to justice, into the possibility of ensuring that we understand not only who is the person who may have shot the bullet that killed Shireen, but also what is there a system behind? Was there anybody who gave this person an order to do to carry out that killing? So we need really to understand the reasons why this has happened and make sure, in order to make sure that it does not happen again. So we have seen reactions, but it's just a very initial step, and much more needs to be done in order to ensure that we really come to some semblance of an end, of ending impunity in this case.
After the release of the report on June 24, the release of the report that has been launched by the United Nations Human Rights Council about the killing, the Permanent Mission of Israel did react in a press release and did say that they were looking also for an independent investigation. And they say that they wanted themselves to know exactly that it was not being done intentionally. That was in the press release. So apparently everybody agrees in having an independent investigation, and apparently everybody agrees in finding out who did shoot, and if it was an independent I would say action, or if it was an order given. So what are next steps now? What will be next? Okay, we spoke about ICC. Yourself, Lina, as you are, I suppose, in contacts with the authorities, with the different journalist organization federations, but also I suppose that you're following closely what is now going to happen in order to continue to fight for justice and continue to believe in the rule of law.
Yes, of course, thank you for that question. We're still following up, and we're trying to exhaust all our options. But it's important to point out that while Israel claims that they didn't shoot Shireen intentionally, all evidence points otherwise. It is clear that Shireen was targeted, and that's based on facts. And if they did not intend to shoot her, then why did they continue to shooting towards the journalist, even when we had someone come in and help them? Help Shireen, they were still shooting towards their direction. Any investigation carried out by, I mean, they said they will not carry out an investigation, but we also know that Israel has a track record of not following up with investigations. At the end, we don't expect anything from them, and we will continue to pressure the US and other international bodies to follow up with an investigation. Again, the evidence is clear, and first and foremost, the Palestinian eyewitnesses who were present at the scene from the first day said that the Israeli soldiers targeted and murdered Shireen. So any other narrative, any doubts, is merely disinformation. That's why the US has an obligation. The US has a responsibility to protect its citizen, And Shireen was a US citizen, she was a journalist, and they need to continue to uphold the values that they preach. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Just on that last point, I mean, I could spend hours just giving you statistics, and they are viable statistics. Some of them are just mind-blowing, where the union in Palestine of journalists monitor every single right violation, and now their statistics are viable, and they put it in front of you, and they reach hundreds, 700 in a year. That doesn't happen in any country. And we are still discussing whether that is being done intentionally or not. Is that kind of really lax kind of attitude that really make things go on for 10 years of UN plan without getting anywhere? For God's sake, I mean, this is happening daily. Yes, you've got, the shootings, that certainly kind of accelerate, the tempo in terms of giving it some attention. But there is this slow dynamic, that it's happening every day. I will tell you an anecdote. The executive, the global executive of the IFJ, held a meeting, just a normal meeting in Ramallah. And they wanted to carry out a protest about the non-recognition of the press card. And they had it was only a group of 20 people, just the executive. There was nobody with them. There were no activists. There were no even kind of the only Palestinian, the only one that is on the executive. And when we went to the Kalandia kind of point, which is very much the border with the Green Line, just to stand with our card peacefully, to say this card is recognized throughout the world. Why doesn't the state of Israel recognize it? We were shot at with stun grenade and gases, and this is the world, leadership of the journalists. What chance has a poor kind of photographer get up in the morning and just want to take pictures? If that happened there, it will happen anywhere. So it is total impunity, and that impunity happens because nobody has been caught. People talk about, well, who gave the order? No, nobody has been caught. Not the one who pulled the trigger, not the one who gave the orders, not the commander of the forces in the West Bank, not the politicians, and you will continue so as long as other people find always an excuse and cover for them. So I'm sorry, maybe I have been a bit hard, but I'm quite emotional about it. We have been involved in this business for a long time, and now we've got a case that we want to discuss, and we're still trying to find, some other way of giving this a chance. The time has come, to stop this intentional, and it is intentional, attack, on journalists. One of my own colleagues, James Miller in the UK, was also shot and killed intentionally. And Israeli, they paid up. They paid up, but they didn't want to say that they did it. So there is a history to that. So let's go back to the history and try to learn from it. And that will give us the impetus of what to do next.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for this testimony. I'm turning to the audience and asking if someone has a question. And if, sir, please, if you could introduce yourself and tell us to whom your question is addressed to.
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to introduce myself. Okay, can you hear me? So first of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Mohammed. I am a third year student at King's College London. So as we can see that in the recent years, we have many journalists has been killed around the world. So I would like to ask why we cannot see any political actions taken by other states to avoid and reduce the number of journalists killed around the world. And because as the UN Plan of Action and Safety of Journalists introduced, that there is a lot of plans and a lot of actions need to be taken. So I would like to ask what are the problems or why we can see that there is a lack of actions taken by the other states.
This is a very tough question. We've seen that when the international community wants to act and react, they're able to do it, because we've seen it recently with Ukraine, that when there's the will, there's the move. So I turn first to Barbara Triumphi from the International Press Institute.
Look, yeah, definitely it's a question of political will. Indeed. Whether, and we have seen maybe more action on Ukraine than on other countries, but even there, journalists have been killed, not necessarily caught in the crossfire. They were targeted, which is the new phenomenon that we are seeing in recent conflicts. Journalists are not caught in the conflict, I mean, are also caught in the crossfire, but they are targeted in conflicts. But even in Ukraine, there will be a lot of work to do in order to ensure that the perpetrators of the killers of journalists are brought to justice. So I don't have an explanation as to why, because it's complicated, because diplomacy, you know, works slowly and is just really. Yeah, it's not a perfect system, and yet it's the best one we have. So that's why we're sitting here today, because we are still thinking, we still want this system of these mechanisms to function. We're still all sitting here. We believe that only through an organization like the United Nations, only through action like the UN Plan of Action for Safety of Journalists, we can achieve some results. And talking about that, what we have carried out initial analysis of what went, of the achievement, if you want, of the past 10 years of the UN Plan of Action. And indeed, there are not many, but where we have seen achievements, it is because change happens at the local level. So where we've seen achievement is because there is some type of cooperation that happens between the government, civil society, and international organization at the local level, because there are national mechanisms, national protection mechanisms being set up that have seen all these different stakeholders cooperate, and that is what really will bring about the real change. Diplomacy is a much weaker tool that we have.
So we said at the beginning of this event that Shireen was working for Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera has been very supportive in defending not only its member, but fighting for justice, against impunity, for the freedom of expression. So I'll turn to Sami El-Ag, the director of Al Jazeera Center for Public Liberties and Human Rights. What are the next steps? What would you like to do, or what you intend to do to continue the fight?
شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية حريصة كل الحرص على المنتسبين لشبكة الجزيرة كإعلاميين، وأيضا حريصة كل الحرص على سلامة وحرية الصحفيين. لذلك هي أنشأت مركز الجزيرة للحريات العامة وحقوق الإنسان. الأحد مهامه هو حماية الصحفيين، حماية قبلية وحماية بعدية، ومتابعة قضايا التضامن مع صحفيين الجزيرة. شبكة الجزيرة قدمت 12 شهيد، بدءا من طارق أيوب مرورا بالجابر ومرورا بكثير إلى أن وصلت إلى شيرين. وكل هؤلاء الجزيرة لم تنسى يوما الدفاع عنهم، وقدمت قضايا في قضاياهم. ولكن للأسف الشديد نحن نفتقر إلى آليات دولية لمحاسبة ومعاقبة هؤلاء القتلة. ولذلك شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية بالتضامن مع المؤسسات المعنية بحماية الصحفيين مثل الIBI والIFJ وغير الCPJ حاولت بعمل الإعلان العالمي لحماية الصحفيين، الديكلاريشن، اللي نحن قدمناه عبر التعاون مع أكثر من 40 منظمة وكثير من المؤسسات الإعلامية. BBC عقدنا اجتماعات في إفريقيا، في أوروبا، هنا كانت في لندن، بالنسبة لدول آسيا، وطلع إعلان عالمي تبنته الجزيرة مع الIBI وبعض المنظمات وقدمناه لليونسكو، مثل كثير من المبادرات اللي تقدمت. فالجزيرة حريصة بأنه يكون في آلية لحماية الصحفيين وتسعى لذلك الأمر. بالنسبة لقضية شيرين خاصة نحن نعتبر شيرين هي قضية وجدت تجاوب عالمي، لكن للأسف الشديد نحن نهتم بالقضية، العالم يهتم بالقضية في وقتها ويصاب بنسيانها سريعا كثير من القضايا. لذلك نحن في قناة الجزيرة أو شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية أنشأنا مع الفريق القانوني الخاص بالشبكة، مع قانونيين دوليين، مع كثير من أيضا المنظمات الساعية في حصول شيرين على العدالة، بإعداد ملف ورفعه لمحكمة الجنايات. نحن اليوم نحن في جنيف، غدا لنا لقاءات مع مسؤولين في المفوضية هنا للمطالبة بتحقيق دولي حتى نستند عليه في متابعتنا القضائية الدولية للجناء وتحقيق العدالة لشيرين أبو عاقلة.
Thank you so much. Lina, would you like to react to that?
Thank you for that, Mr. Sami. And at the end of the day, Shireen wasn't just our daughter as a family. At the end of the day, Shireen's second and biggest family was Al Jazeera. And we continue to thank them when we're forever grateful for the continuous support they have provided us and our family with ever since the day Shireen was murdered. And we continue alongside Al Jazeera to call for justice, to call for all international bodies, international organizations to actually not let this go, not let Shireen's story die, because Shireen's story is similar to many other journalists who've been targeted and who've been killed. That's why justice for Shireen is the same justice for other journalists. And again, we continue to thank Al Jazeera for continuously supporting us, supporting the case of Shireen and the fight for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you for these words. And these will be the last words of this event organized, side event organized during that human rights session of the Council of Human Rights here in Geneva at the United Nations. I would like to express my thanks to Barbara Triunfi. Thank you so much for being with us, Barbara. Thank you, of course, Jim Boumela, to be with us too. Thank you to Sami Al-Haq from Al Jazeera and for organizing this event. And of course, our warmest thank you to Lina Abu Akleh, and we wish you all the best, and we will stand at your side as much as we can to support this fight against impunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon and good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks. And thank you to you.
Thank you. So you did not give me your comment. No, I don't have. Okay, so I'll give you.